Hi, this is Sebastian Braxton, and in this second season of Verse by Verse, we wanted to include a new component called Between the Lines. Now, you probably remember in my intro video that I talked about how the book of Philemon was used to justify a fugitive slave law back in the early 1800s in America when slaves were fleeing from the South to the North and not being returned to their masters. This raises the question that does the Bible really justify slavery? Well, we still want to maintain those components in our series where we go each verse at a time, bringing out devotional lessons. But we also wanted to make sure that we could give you the story around the text in those biblical times, as well as connect it to our modern day world and context and question of does the Bible really justify modern slavery as we understand it in America? Now, I think one of the first places to start in answering this question is really to dive into what exactly were the circumstances of slavery in ancient Rome at that time. We want to look at a book written by Justinian called his Digest, which compiles materials on Roman law that predate even Christianity, going back from 100 BC. He defines slavery as an institution of the law of nations, contrary to nature, by which a person is subjected to an alien will or dominion, end quote. Now, when you look at this, the first thing to keep in mind is the law of nations is just the law that governs all the people in the Roman Empire. The contrary to nature part comes because in Roman law, every person was born free, and slavery was a result of war. In fact, the word slave comes from the Latin word servus, which means to save, because the idea was we captured your nation and then we preserved you or saved you alive, and now you became a slave to our nation. Now, this is important because that tells us that Onesimus, as a slave with a Greek name, he was probably conquered by the Roman Empire, as their empire spanned from, Western Europe all the way down to Northern Africa, Turkey, into the Middle East. Well, if you look at that, Onesimus understandably would want to run away because he was forced into this slave lifestyle as a result of probably being conquered by the Roman Empire. And so that makes perfect sense. Well, that's not really the context of American slavery. Where American slavery was really about tricking people and forcing them and kidnapping them into a boat and bringing them across the ocean and forcing them into labor, which was not so much an issue of conquering and war as it was really an issue of thievery and deception. Now, moving forward, we also recognize that at that time, 33% of the population of the city of Rome were slaves, and 20% of the population of the entire empire were slaves. That's approximately 10 to 12 million slaves. And we imagine that the same was true amongst Christianity, which was budding up at that time in the Roman Empire. You're probably expecting about 20% of all Christians at that time were probably slaves. So one of the things that's really important to recognize is that slaves were a symbol of wealth. So if you were a poorer person, you probably owned maybe one or two slaves. If you were a part of the Senate, you probably owned up to 400 or more slaves. And if you're a part of the Caesari Familia or the Familia Caesari, Caesar's family or household, you're talking about 20,000 slaves. Now, a slave cost anywhere from 500 to 600 denarii, and a person who was just a regular adult male who had no skill or education. But if you were more educated and skilled, let's say like a vine dresser, you're talking upwards towards 2,000 denarii. Now, a denarii was the average salary per day of a person working at that time. Well, the average salary in the United States is $55,000 a year. So one slave would cost you $110,000 just to do that transition over to our time. Thus, the senators were really like millionaires and Caesar was really like a multi-billionaire. Now, when we look at that, that tells us that Philemon was a very wealthy individual. In fact, when Paul greeted him, as we noticed in verse 2, he says, "To the church that is in your house." Now, that lets you know that his house was big enough to hold the church, which was probably, some people think, the church in Colossae, but also the fact that he could own a slave. That means for Onesimus to run away, you're talking about upwards towards $500,000 completely gone when it runs away. So you can understand where a person who lost $500,000 would be extremely distraught at that time. Now, I'm going to pause here, but in our next episode of Between the Lines, we're going to develop this a little bit more and really start unpacking some of the assumptions people make when they use the Bible to justify slavery. You don't want to miss it as we continue this on our next episode of Between the Lines.